There's a lot of confusion about grilling on one hand and barbecue on the other, and many people use those two terms interchangeably, but they're very, very different. We've spent a lot of time on grilling, so let's talk about barbecue. Barbecue got its start in the Caribbean, where meats were rubbed heavily with a spice mix, and then they were cooked slowly over a slow, smoky fire, and that would, in effect, cook and preserve the meat. Little by little, that tradition made its way up from the Caribbean to the Carolinas. In the Carolinas, they roast whole hog about the same way, and they've got a really delicious sauce with a lot of vinegar in it. But if you go to South Carolina, that whole hog barbecue morphs a little bit, and where there's a little pocket of German immigrants, they take the ketchup out of that sauce and in goes mustard. Now, if you were to make your way west, and barbecue were to come with you, what you would discover is that in every new locale, there's a slight variation depending on who the immigrant population is and what's available to you. So as an example, Kansas City is a terminus for the meat industry. You can get any kind of barbecued meat you want, not just pork, but also beef, not just shoulder, but also ribs. Go down to Texas, and Texas, beef is king. Specifically, beef brisket. So beef brisket with the flavors from across the border to the south is what that barbecue tradition looks like. There are barbecue traditions in Tennessee and Kentucky where they serve their barbecue with a Brunswick stew that has game in it, sometimes even squirrel, other times just chicken. It's a very rich tradition that morphs from region to region to region. So what ties it all together? Well, take a look at what I've got here. These are some of the cuts of meat that you will see used for barbecue. Here's the brisket that they use in Texas. Here's a couple of different kinds of ribs, back ribs and spare ribs. Here's pork butt. This is a half a pork butt. And this pork butt right here is from the shoulder. Don't be confused. The reason it's called a pork butt is that traditionally it was sold in barrels that were known as butts, but this is a pork shoulder. What ties all of these cuts together is that they're heavily marbled and they're tough. You can't throw them on a hot grill and expect them to be anything but cooked and tough. So barbecue is a low, slow cooking technique that allows these meats to gently get more and more tender. You can imagine that they are braising in their own juices, and meat at the end of the day is about 75% moisture. So whether it's ribs, brisket, or pork shoulder, we need to start in one particular way. We need to season this meat. And because the flavor of smoke is so pronounced, we need an aggressive seasoning. So I'm going to call my friend Chef Patrick to come in and talk a little bit about barbecue rubs, and then we'll get all of this meat, whether rib, brisket, or pork butt, we'll get it onto the grill to cook low and slow so that we can enjoy some barbecue.
I'd like to talk a minute about dry rubs and the difference between dry rubs and marinades. So in barbecue, typically you'll see dry rubs as we see here. I've got a couple of different examples that I want to talk about, one on the esoteric side and one on the traditional side. Marinades are often used to marinate meat and as a flavoring agent, but in this particular case of barbecue, we don't want to use marinades because marinades typically have acid, and acid prohibits browning. So dry rubs allow us to achieve a couple of different results that are really helpful in barbecue. One of the things that we look for in good barbecue is a crust that forms on the meat. We call it a bark. It's literally this crusty, thick mass on the outside that when you slice through gives you this beautiful smoke ring on the outside and a really flavorful crust on the surrounding the exterior. Traps all the juices in. So dry rubs, what they do is they draw the moisture out of the surface of the meat, right? They dry out that surface. They also prevent bacterial growth. When you're cooking something for a long period of time, you worry about the potential of meat going bad, spoiling. So we want to make sure that we have that bacterial element on the outside as a kill step. So heavily salted dry rubs will help in that as well. The other thing that they start to do is they start to draw the moisture out of the meat, and they flavor the meat. Flavoring the meat's really, really important. Let's talk about smoke. Smoke is an interesting phenomenon. So if you think about what smoke is, it's a bunch of particulate matter, a bunch of esters and volatile compounds that are trapped in a gas. And that gas, we're basically trying to take that gas, surround the meat in it, and then look for that to penetrate into the meat. And as that happens, you get great flavor development, and again, you get that smoke ring that I talked about that's really, really beautiful. So with that, we put the dry rub on the meat, we put it in the smoker, and then it becomes a very delicate balance between temperature and humidity. If something is too hot, the meat gets too dry. At that point, a crust will form on the outside. We'll lose those volatile compounds. They'll just stay on the outside. They won't penetrate into the meat. We won't get that great, great flavor development that we're looking for. If we have too much moisture in the environment, then the water gets beaded up on the surface of the meat. It's too wet. The volatile compounds get trapped in that water and they roll right off of the item. So we don't want that either. So looking at the proper range of humidity and temperature inside that smoker is really, really critical when smoking. And achieving that crust on the outside is really the ultimate goal that we're looking for. And so let's get into our dry rubs here. I want to talk about two different rubs. Let's talk about this one first. So we'll start with, get back to the traditional in a moment. But right now, let's look at this sort of interesting and esoteric dry rub that I've been using lately. So it's a coffee and chocolate dry rub, which is kind of fun. So here I have some ground espresso beans. I have some kosher salt, brown sugar, some chili powder, some allspice, some garlic powder, some dry mustard, black pepper, cumin, and cocoa powder. All these mixed together to give you a really kind of a cool chocolate cocoa spice note to it, hard spices, really, really interesting and flavorful dry rub. For our traditional dry rub, which we're going to use today, I have more traditional ingredients, obviously. So here I have chili powder, I have cumin, I have kosher salt, brown sugar, white sugar, black pepper, cayenne, and paprika. So you'll notice that in the order of these, there's a quantitative measure going across the board here. So these are all equal parts. So it's equal parts of the chili powder, equal part of the cumin, equal part of both the sugars, the salt, the pepper, and then we have about a half part of the cayenne because obviously that's quite hot, and then we have 2 parts of the paprika. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to dump this into our bowl here. And I'm just going to mix this up. So when you have a bunch of different things like this in here that are all really strong flavors, you want to make sure that you mix it really well. I'm looking at this mixture and I've got different colors of things in here, different textures of things in here. So I'm going to rub the brown sugar between my fingers and break up any little pieces of brown sugar that I may come across. I'm looking for the mixture to be homogeneous in color. So if I still see streaks of different things in here, that tells me that I need to mix it more. And those different colors in the ingredients kind of help me to dictate when this is fully mixed. Digging to the bottom and pulling it up to the top is very helpful. Once I feel like I have this mixed thoroughly, then we'll get to our meats. So our first piece of meat here, as Chef Bill mentioned, is our beef brisket. Very, very popular in Texas barbecue. So the brisket is a fairly tough cut of meat. It's got a fat layer that runs between 2 pieces of muscle here, lots of connective tissue. If you were just to slice this off and throw a piece of this on the grill and cook it until it was medium rare, it would be basically inedible. It'd be really difficult to eat. So what we try to do in barbecue is cook this slow, and by cooking it slow, we maintain a moderate temperature range with this piece of meat, and what that does is it breaks down connective tissue. And when you break down connective tissue, you do a couple of different things. Connective tissue constricts at high heats very violently. And considering that the muscle meat in this is about 75% water, as that connective tissue shrinks and squeezes, it forces the water out of the meat. Barbecue allows us to keep the temperature range at a point where that connective tissue doesn't have that violent reaction and actually melts and turns into liquid gelatin. So that actually moistens the meat instead of drying the meat. So let's get to our rub. So I'm actually going to put this back in here, rub it in the hotel pan just to keep from making a mess. And I'm going to be really pretty aggressive with this rub. And I want to make sure that I'm rubbing not only the surface of the meat, but if there's any cuts or incisions or permeations or perforations in this, that I get the rub down in those as well, like that right there. So if you think about how much surface area is exposed to the rub versus how much meat there actually is here, it's only maybe 20% of the meat is getting rub, I would guess. So I want to be really aggressive with that dry rub because it's got to translate into the entire inside of this meat in terms of flavor that isn't going to get any of this spice mix. So once I have this rubbed, I'm going to bring it over. We've got a couple of barbecues going here. And as Bill mentioned, the idea is low and slow, so we don't have a lot of heat going in those barbecues. So that's got a nice rub on it. It's going to take this directly over to our big Weber. And I'm going to place this right here. Now you'll note in this Weber that I've got heat sources on both sides, but not directly under where the meat's going to be. So what that does is that keeps the heat away from the meat directly, and it brings the heat up and around in the barrel and traps it there like an oven. So we're going to leave a little room here for our pork butt, which we're going to look at next. So our pork butt actually is a piece off of the shoulder, and there's a fairly large piece of bone in that shoulder piece that needs to be removed. And what that means is there's a lot more surface area on this that's going to be exposed to the rub. So that's why pork butt's really, really flavorful, because you got a little bit more area to season. And it's got, you know, because it's a shoulder, it has just as much connective tissue as that brisket does. So same idea, cooking low and slow, breaking down that connective tissue, taking advantage of that connective tissue and that collagen and utilizing that to moisten the meat. Okay. I think I've got that pretty well rubbed. So I'm going to just sort of form this into a small, compact little piece, kind of tuck these pieces together. So as that cooks, it'll kind of maintain that form, that shape. So I'm going to place this in the Weber also. Now I'm going to go ahead and get this guy started. So I'm going to take some wood chips. You can see the coals are nice and hot here. I'm going to take some wood chips, and these wood chips have been soaked in water. So soaking the wood chips in water basically delays the process of them starting to smoke because they have to evaporate the water out of them first. And that helps to keep some moisture trapped inside of the dome as well, because like I said, that smoke is a delicate balance between temperature and humidity. So I'm just going to sprinkle a few wood chips on both sides. And then I'm going to close up the lid. And I have a damper here that controls airflow, and I also have another one on the bottom, so two different dampers. And that's the way we control the temperature inside of this. So opening and closing this damper both on the bottom and the top either increase or minimize the amount of airflow I have in here. The more airflow I have, the hotter those coals are going to burn. The less airflow I have, the lower the temperature is going to go. So I'm going to start off with these about halfway open right now. And let's get back to our ribs. So ribs, I talked a little bit about connective tissue earlier. So ribs have a particularly tough piece of connective tissue on them on the inside of the ribs. We actually take that membrane off because it's really chewy and doesn't really break down like a lot of the other types of connective tissue does. So we just grab a hold of this, we get it with a towel, and you can literally just peel that all the way back. You can see how tough that is. I can't even like get my finger through it. Really, really, really tough connective tissue. So these are baby back ribs. So these are off of the loin of the animal. Interestingly enough, these are the reason why boneless pork loin is the only cut of meat that's cheaper to buy boneless than it is to buy on the bone, because they actually take those bones and charge a premium price for the baby back ribs, and so they can sell the boneless loin cheaper than any other cut of meat. So we're going to get some rub on these guys, both sides, of course. And then we've got a second Weber going for our ribs. A little bit lower temperature. These are a much smaller piece of meat, obviously, so they're not going to take nearly as long to cook as that brisket and that butt are. I'm going to go ahead and add wood chips to one side of this grill now, because I have these little flaps here that fold down, and I'm going to need some of that room for the other grills there, or for the other ribs rather. Flip those guys back like that. And let's get to our next rib before the bees do. So this is a spare rib. You can see these are dramatically larger. So this is the lower section of the bones. The baby back ribs come off the back of the animal. These ribs drop down and go around the belly down where the bacon part of the animal is. So these are pretty big, not quite as tender as the baby back ribs. So if I were to cut the tip of this off, these would be what would be called St. Louis ribs, but I wanted to keep this big so there was a real contrast between the two styles of rib there. So now I'm going to rub these guys down. Pretty straightforward with the ribs. There's no real permeations or convolutions in the ribs. Little flap of the belly piece still attached here, so that's going to be nice and fatty. And we are ready to go in the smoker. So okay, I'm going to have these just shingling slightly, because as they cook, they're going to shrink up quite a bit, free up some more room in there. For our last rib, this is what's called a country style rib. So this is a chunk off the shoulder. You can actually see a bit of the shoulder blade piece still in this. And these are really thicker. You could actually cut this and make a boneless. There's boneless country short ribs as well, which are really tasty. This is just a little bit thicker piece of meat, a little bit heartier piece, and it tends to be just a little bit more tender than the ones right around the bone once it's cooked. So I'm going to close this up now, and I'm going to let those go. These are going to take quite a while to cook. With barbecue, like I said, we're talking about low and slow. So we may be cooking anywhere from 2 to up to 12 hours in certain cases with some brisket preparations, depending on the temperature that you're cooking at. So we'll probably check back on these in a couple of hours. In the meantime, I'm going to call my friend Chef Bill, and he's going to talk to us about sauces.
All right. This has been on for a while now. This is an important part of barbecue, staying around and making sure that you can monitor the progress of what's happening. So these barbecue grills have a great feature, and that is that there's a little thermometer right here. This is where we have the ribs, and if you take a look, this is right at about 200 degrees right now, and I'm still seeing a little bit of smoke coming out of the vents. If it were much hotter than 200, 225, I might damp it down. If the smoke ever begins to subside a little bit, I can always add a few more of the soaked chips. Over here, where we have the brisket, it's just below 200 degrees, and this piece of meat's going to cook for a long time. Figure 10 to 12 hours for the brisket, and for the piece of pork, maybe 5. So it's good that it cooks slower and longer. You can see a nice head of smoke coming off of here, so I'm not going to touch this at all, and instead, I'm going to come over here and we're going to talk about sauces a little bit. Now, I'll start with a little story. I went to the supermarket this morning, and on offer, 65 different barbecue sauces in our local supermarket. Admittedly, it's grilling season right now, or barbecue season, but that's a lot of choice. So what do you need from a barbecue sauce? Because with that many choices, it gets overwhelming. Well, let's start with a simple barbecue sauce and kind of tease it apart and see if we can understand what's going on. This is the sort of sauce that you will see in North Carolina, a vinegary barbecue sauce. So here's a quart of apple cider vinegar. And to that, I'm going to add sweetness in two forms. I'm going to add some brown sugar, and I'm going to add some molasses. So think about this in terms of flavor. I've got acidity to cut through the richness of the meat that's grilling. I've got some sweetness, which is a great adjunct to any sort of smoky flavor. Think bacon, for instance. And so those two things in tandem will help us make a great tasting dish. Let's go a step further. I want some aromatics in there, so here's garlic powder. I'm going to add garlic powder to this. I've got some salt, and I'm going to add salt in there. And garlic gives us a depth of flavor that this sauce did not have before. Salt, for obvious reasons, makes this taste better. Now, I also want to get some spice in this. We have some spice on the rub, but take a look here. In goes pepper flakes, and if you have a favorite hot sauce, I would suggest adding a little bit of that. So now we've got aromatic garlic, we've got the heat of the peppers, we've got the acid that cuts through the richness of the meat, and we've got the sweetness and the salt that balance one another. In terms of basic tastes, this is starting to come together as a nicely balanced sauce. And then finally, here's a little bit of Worcestershire sauce if you want some savory notes in that sauce. So, as simple as it is, this sauce could be ready to go. Now we have a choice to make. If I wanted to use this as a sauce, I certainly could. I'm going to taste it briefly. It's powerful, but it's got a nice balance of flavor. Some people would just take this sauce and use it periodically to baste their pork, what they call a mop. They just mop this on there, and it keeps the meat moist and it flavors it while it cooks. If we wanted to turn it into an honest-to-goodness sauce, we could add here some ketchup. And so now this is a vinegar-based sauce with tomato. This is really what sauces look like in North Carolina. With that high quantity of vinegar, it just makes sense because they have whole hog barbecue, and that whole hog barbecue is so rich that you need the vinegar to cut through it. Let me set these dishes aside, and we'll talk a little bit more. If you go to South Carolina from North Carolina, you will bump into a group of immigrants who originally settled there from Germany. And they have a fondness for mustard. They have a history with mustard. And so imagine that we took this, and instead of a dark sugar like molasses, we just used white sugar, and instead of ketchup, we added yellow mustard. That's the sort of sauce that you see being used in South Carolina. Now, if you go to Tennessee, they have a really interesting sauce called a white sauce. And the white sauce, imagine that the mustard was gone, the ketchup was gone, the dark sugars were gone in place of something a little bit lighter, and they put mayonnaise in this. And that's the white barbecue sauce that oftentimes you'll see in Tennessee. Make your way to Kansas City. They love sauce that's tomato-based. And because they cook a lot of ribs in Kansas City, which don't really cook for as long as brisket does, for instance, or even pork butt, they can afford to make a sauce that's slightly thicker. And so more ketchup and a lot more sugar. They love sweet sauces. And then travel down to Texas where they've got brisket, and brisket cooks for a long time, so you might want to have a thinner sauce again. It's tomato-based, but a little bit thinner, and interestingly enough, it gets the influence of spices from across the border, Mexico. So you'll see cumin in here. You will see all different kinds of chilies in here, and the sauce will be slightly thinner. But this is a great place to start to understand barbecue sauce. Now, here's something else I've got. While I was at the store, I bought a commercial barbecue sauce. There it is. I can taste it, and I recognize the same interesting balance of flavors. This has a lot more ketchup. It's a little bit sweeter, but it's not a bad barbecue sauce. And so what we might consider doing is buying a commercial barbecue sauce, tasting it, and then deciding if we like the way it tastes, and if we don't, we have a good handle on how we might change it. As an example, If I have in my refrigerator some blackberries or some blueberries that are a little bit over the hill, I've got no problem whatsoever making a blackberry or a blueberry barbecue sauce just by cooking these in that sauce. Let's say I've got a bottle of root beer that is slightly flat. I don't want to drink it anymore. I could reduce that down, and that could be the sweet spice and also the sweetness in that sauce. I'm fond of barbecue sauces that have marmalade as sweetness. Get to Kentucky and you might see lots of barbecue sauces with bourbon and brown sugar. I grew up in the Northeast. There is maple syrup that can make its way in here. You might even go to your refrigerator and bump into some Asian products like sweet Thai chili sauce or like ponzu sauce or katsu sauce, which is sort of a barbecue sauce that they use on pork cutlets in Japan. And these can all be added to a commercial barbecue sauce, and before you know it, you've come up with your own signature sauce. This should be fun. It shouldn't be hard. You can find plenty of recipes online. There's plenty to choose from the store, but what you need to do is make sure you understand what each component brings to the finished dish. Smoky meat that is rich is full flavored, and you need a sauce that can stand up to that level of flavor. When you get some time, just buy some barbecue sauce, take it home, and play around with it a little bit. Open the refrigerator, see what's there on the refrigerator drawer, see what you want to use up, and I can guarantee you before you know it, you'll be coming up with your own signature barbecue sauce recipes.
And now all of our meat is fully cooked. It's looking beautiful. We've got our brisket, our pork butt, and our ribs. I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna take a look at the ribs now. Got beautiful color on the ribs. You can see the bones sticking out here. That tells me that that meat is constricted. I can literally push my finger. If I push too hard, that piece is gonna slide right off. That's how tender this meat is. So these have been cooking in the dry rub. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. We cook these to completion here on the grill using that indirect heat method. You could also wait until the bone starts to become exposed on these. They're partially cooked. You could then take them, wrap them in aluminum foil, and just kind of steam them in their own juices, either back on the grill or even in an oven if you needed to free up space on the grill. So what I want to do is I want to add a little bit of moisture to these and a little bit more flavor just by brushing a little bit of sauce on here. So this is a tomato-based sauce, pretty traditional barbecue. I'm just going to lightly glaze these guys, and then we'll take a look at our brisket. You can see our brisket here is really, when I talked about that bark, that's what we want to see, is that beautiful crust on that brisket there. Look at that, beautiful. So when I cut into this, we'll talk about the smoke ring. So I'm just going to take the end of this right off. And you can see all around the perimeter of this, there's that red kind of hue. That's our smoke ring. That tells me they got really nice smoke development, really nice flavor development into this brisket as we cooked it. So typically with the brisket, you've got the meat running in a grain in this direction, and we want to cut against that grain. So I'm just going to cut slices. You can see how tender the knife goes through this like butter. You can see the marbling in it, the fatty part of the brisket as we get up into the thicker centerpiece here. Really beautiful. It smells great. Wow, can't wait to eat that. Next, we're going to take a look at our pork shoulder. So you notice I have two spatulas, especially with that brisket. Trying to lift this off, I'm taking a chance on it falling apart. That's how tender it is. So I want to make sure I get, let me go for this guy here, I think, that I really secure that. It'd be a real tragedy to take this far and then drop it on the ground while you were trying to transfer it over to the cutting board. So here, instead of slicing, we want to shred. So we want pulled pork or shredded pork. So we got a couple of forks here. You can take the fork, hold the meat in place with one, and literally just shred the meat. And we want to mix in the outer crust with the shredded meat. Let it kind of pull away. We want fatty pieces. We want all of that stuff mixed together and served. Oftentimes this is served as a sandwich. It can easily just be served as is. We're going to toss a little bit of our vinegary barbecue-based sauce next to it, the traditional Carolina flavor profile. And this also smells amazing. See, it just pulls apart. Get a small platter here for our nice mix of everything. You see the crispy exterior, see the fatty part, you see the moist, stringy meat. And now we'll get back to our ribs. First off, our baby backs. And it's really simple to know where to cut the baby backs. So you just want to go right between the bones. And that's what we want to see, the meat literally falling off of the bones. And I guarantee that somebody wants that end piece, so I'm not going to let that get away. Now we're going to look at our St. Louis ribs, or our spare ribs rather. Same thing here, just looking right between the bones. Cutting between the bones, I keep the skin intact, the meat stays nice and clean. It's a little trickier with the baby backs just because they're so tender. And finally for our country style pork. So the bone literally has fallen out of this. So I'm just going to slice this up into a few pieces, platter that with the rest, and then I think we are good to go. What a feast. So I'm going to give just a little dressing to my pork. Try to get some of those chili flakes right on top there so you can see them. Make sure there's plenty of liquid. Wow. Brisket's going to stand on its own, and then my ribs already have that glaze on them, so they don't need anything else. So here we have a very traditional barbecue, right? We've got our brisket, beautiful. We've got traditional coleslaw. You can see the coleslaw is kind of soupy and soft. That's from making the coleslaw ahead of time, letting the acid and the dressing sort of break down the cellulose structure in the coleslaw. We've got our baked beans here, which just smell delicious. Nice sweet accompaniment. And then of course we have just basic white bread. Again, our pork shredded with our Carolina barbecue sauce. All three varieties of ribs with the tomato-based sauce and the beautiful smoky brisket. Who could ask for anything more?